Hello and good evening or good afternoon, depending on where in the country or where in the world you're tuning in tonight. My name is Rasheed Clarke, Marketing and Communications Specialist at Crohn's and Colitis Canada, and I'm joined on the screen here with Jennifer Ball, registered dietitian, who is here to answer questions that you may have about nutrition and Crohn's and colitis. We've been asking our communities on social media ahead of the chat tonight to put in their questions about diet and IBD. So we've got a number of questions already lined up that we'll get through to the course of the night. And if you have questions or comments about diet and IBD, please drop them into the comments thread down below this video, and we'll get to as many questions and comments as we can tonight. Again, thanks so much for tuning in. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. Just a reminder that the information presented here tonight during this talk is meant for informational purposes, should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult your doctor before making any changes to your diet or treatment plan. Now we're nice and legal. And I will introduce now Jennifer Ball, who is a registered dietitian working in the outpatient GI medicine and surgery and home TPN at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. That is the long title. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry from the University of Western Ontario and a Master of Science degree in human nutrition from McGill University. Throughout her career, Jennifer has worked with people dealing with a wide variety of nutritional concerns. Her focus now is on parenteral nutrition support and therapeutic diet education. So Jennifer, welcome, and thank you so much for being here tonight with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
All right, so again, as I mentioned off the top, we have been promoting this Facebook Live talk for a little while and asking people ahead of time for their questions. So we'll get to a few general ones that have come in from across our social media channels. And again, if you do have questions throughout the course of the talk tonight, drop them in the comments and we'll get to as many as we can. So off the top, this is kind of a common question just related to Crohn's and colitis. Does what you eat cause Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis?
This is a great question, and often the first one I'm asked when I'm meeting somebody for the first time. And the simple answer is no. Whenever I'm meeting somebody who has Crohn's or colitis, and especially if they've been relatively newly diagnosed, I'll often start our conversation by saying, diet is neither cause nor cure for your Crohn's or colitis. With the research that we have available at present, we really do believe that it's sort of an interplay, essentially an abnormal immune response to some suspected environmental triggers in a genetically susceptible individual. So the phrase bears repeating. Diet is neither cause nor cure for your Crohn's or colitis.
Very good answer. Maybe not the answer that some people are looking for, but again, worth stating again, just for the purpose of letting people know that I think importantly that they're not to blame for their disease as a result of anything that they may have had in their diet in the past, based on the understanding that we have about IBD right now. And so I guess the next question from that, how does diet influence someone's symptoms if they do have Crohn's or colitis?
This is a great question. So this is a really important distinction in my practice. We know that diet does not cause IBD, but we do know that some of the foods in our diet can trigger symptoms of our IBD. As most patients know, living with IBD, especially if you're in an active flare, can really make it difficult for your body to digest and absorb food, nutrients, and water. So again, while your diet is not triggering the underlying disease process, certain foods can trigger those gastrointestinal symptoms. However, these diet triggers are very individual. I can't say that enough. I like to say you sort of can't compare notes with your neighbor. So to give an example, probably one of the most common examples from my practice, most patients come in, they're concerned that they're experiencing diarrhea or an increased frequency of loose or watery bowel movements. And the most common trigger, in my practice, tends to be foods that are high in simple sugars, specifically things like fruit juices, pop, sports drinks, really any sugar sweetened beverage, but even things like candies and desserts can trigger these symptoms as well. And it's sort of through an effect that we call like osmotic diarrhea. Another example may be in patients who are looking to increase the amount of fiber in their diets, specifically insoluble fiber. So this insoluble fiber is the type that we would tend to find in the skins of fruits and vegetables. We can also find it in whole nuts, legumes, beans, etc. And this insoluble fiber tends to bulk our stools and make them heavier. This means that they're more likely to transit the gut faster and have like a laxative effect. So again, while patients may be striving for certain diet goals, these aspects of their diet can trigger symptoms. However, again, diet triggers are very individual. And so really the only way to know what yours are is by paying close attention to the foods that you're eating and tracking and monitoring your symptoms. And of course, it never hurts to have the help of a registered dietitian to do that.
Of course. And as well, as we sort of mentioned off the top, to be working with your doctors as well when in case the diet changes are suggested, or if you want to make dietary changes, it's always a good idea to consult with your GI before making any drastic changes. So next question, and again, we kind of addressed this off the top, but it's probably worth asking again and maybe reiterating again, because there's a lot of information out there, and different studies, different diets are coming out. So as of now, from what we know about the disease, is there a diet that can cure Crohn's or colitis?
No. As it stands right now, there is no evidence-based diet approach that can either prevent or cure Crohn's or colitis. And again, I know this is not a popular answer, but believe me, as a dietitian working in this field, if there was a diet prescription I could hand out, I would, and I would do so happily. Part of the reason that I love working with people living with IBD is that they are extremely well educated about diet and nutrition, and they're also great self-advocates. However, for the same reason, they can often fall prey to people looking to sell this idea of there being a diet cure or a supplement cure. And so for that reason, there are a lot of elimination and fad diets that have become quite popular, sort of in the popular media and online, as they're geared towards our patients living with IBD. So just as some examples, gluten-free or dairy-free diets, no red meats, the specific carbohydrate diet, paleo diets, and low FODMAP diets. However, if I can kind of touch on the issues with elimination diets, sort of on the whole, like on the broad spectrum, the main issues are that often there's not a lot of scientific evidence to back up these diets. Or what tends to happen is that there's sort of a kernel of scientific truth that's kind of blown up into a larger rationale that's not evidence-based. From my perspective, the issue with these elimination diets is that they often omit whole food groups, and specific vitamins and minerals are often, at risk for becoming deficient in somebody's diet. So this can predispose our already predisposed population towards either becoming malnourished or worsening malnutrition. The other issue I find is that some of these elimination diets can actually worsen stomach discomfort, gas, and cramping. And from the patient perspective, they can also be very difficult to follow. They often require a significant number of restrictions, which means a lot of time and energy has to be invested in planning, preparing, and purchasing their food for their meals. And that's not necessarily always realistic. And I think most importantly, this is something that you touched on, some of these elimination diets, again, contribute to the sense that one is to blame for their Crohn's or colitis activity. If I'm not able to follow this restrictive diet and I have a flare, it's because I've done something wrong. And that's definitely not how we want our patients to feel.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a number of well-known and now well-recognized diets like the selective carbohydrate diet. So something that we can get into a little bit more, because now we're going to go through some of the questions that we received across our social media channels in the lead up to this event. So this one was, I'd like to have information about the specific carbohydrate diet in treating IBD. Again, something that has come up a number of times. We've seen some studies that have come out. I know that there was a study out of Seattle a few years ago of it showing some effect in a small number of pediatric patients. But from what we know in terms of the SCD and how it works with IBD, what do we know right now?
So right now, and thank you for that great question, Claire. Right now, what we know about the specific carbohydrate diet, the sort of rationale behind it, is that more complex carbohydrates or larger chain sugars are not well digested and absorbed in the small bowel. And the idea behind the diet kind of postulates that, when these sugars or these complex carbohydrates are not well absorbed, they tend to lead to sort of this bacterial or yeast overgrowth, which can ultimately damage the lining of the intestine. And again, sort of like perpetuates this idea, this damage, this ongoing cycle. However, as you were great to point out, a lot of the research using the specific carbohydrate diet with people living with IBD is primarily in very small groups of pediatric patients. And typically this type of research is what we call retrospective. So in general, they tend to have looked at charts sort of after the fact. Furthermore, in a subset of that research, patients were allowed to continue taking did continue taking the medications that were prescribed to help them manage their IBD. So on the basis of that research, we really aren't able to conclude that there's a causative effect. So we can't say that following the specific carbohydrate diet can help to heal mucosal lining. Because again, we're looking at this after the fact. So we really do need a lot more prospective research, meaning, sort of randomized controlled trials, sort of our gold standard, and specifically in adults, to say whether this type of diet would work in the absence of other factors, meaning patients aren't taking other medications. There's really nothing else at play. It's sort of hard to do that type of research in the real world. The other issue, as I touched on earlier with the specific carbohydrate diet, is that it is tricky to follow and it is restrictive. So again, calcium, vitamin D, patients often miss these nutrients in their diet when following the specific carbohydrate diet. And because our patients living with IBD are already predisposed to deficiencies in those vitamins and minerals, really it's difficult to recommend a diet that could worsen that situation.
Okay, so obviously we're still looking to hopefully find more information, more studies on the specific carbohydrate diet. I mean, again, promising signs. Certainly, we don't want to rule anything out, but I think it's a little bit early in the game, and we obviously need more research across a wide number of patients to really be able to know definitively what's going to work for a large number of people. So on the topic again of other diets. This one from Kathy and Kimberly earlier, interested in the low FODMAP diet. So, Jennifer, if you could explain just a little bit about what the low FODMAP diet is and what we know about how it can influence someone with IBD.
For sure. So low FODMAP is definitely gaining popularity nowadays. I'm certainly getting more referrals for it in my practice. Just to back up and talk a little bit about what low FODMAP means. So FODMAP is an acronym, stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. So lots of big words in there that really just mean carbohydrates, sugars, and sugar alcohols that ferment. And again, sort of the idea behind this is that these specific foods that are rich in these FODMAPs tend to not be well absorbed in the gut. And so they tend to ferment. The bacteria kind of feast on them and they ferment in the gut. And this can cause, or is sort of associated with a whole host of symptoms, but typically gas and flatulence, bloating, abdominal discomfort, and diarrhea. The low FODMAP diet was really designed for people living with IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome. However, like I said, I'm seeing more referrals for it now in my practice from a symptom management perspective. The research really says that, again, there's no association between low FODMAP eating and mucosal healing. So it does not affect the underlying disease process, right? Where it's sort of not healing your Crohn's or colitis. However, we think it may have more of a benefit from a functional perspective. So like I said, for helping with that bloating, gas, flatulence, abdominal discomfort. Now, low FODMAP is really designed sort of in 3 phases, like most elimination diets. You would follow sort of a strict low FODMAP way of eating for anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks. And at that point, you start to very gradually reintroduce individual foods. So one at a time. And then you monitor and track your symptoms. And that allows you to identify your specific triggers for your symptoms. Now, overall, I usually warn the patients I meet with of a few things. First of all, the low FODMAP way of eating can be very involved. The sort of simple version of doing low FODMAP requires lots of individual reading and research. Myself and one of my colleagues likes to joke that the simple patient education handout is about 16 pages long and requires, there's lots of lists of foods to choose and foods to avoid. So it can be very overwhelming at first. It's certainly not for the faint of heart. And I know one study I read was saying that people who are most likely to adhere to the low FODMAP way of eating tend to work part-time and tend to be of a sort of higher socioeconomic status. So the idea being that they have more time and financial resources to invest in this way of eating. The other sort of caveat or the warning that I provide is that it's not a silver bullet. So quite frequently, what I mean by that is that there are low FODMAP foods that will trigger GI symptoms. And so quite frequently I'll have like a very confused person in my office. And when I ask what's wrong, they'll say, but if I eat this, I will be so sick. And so again, it's sort of this overabundance of information and fad diets is providing more confusion than it is clarity. And again, it's adding additional restrictions to somebody's diet whose diet may already be very restricted. So for that reason, I will not recommend low FODMAP diets for anybody who's experienced unintentional weight loss in the last 6 months, anyone who's in an active Crohn's or colitis flare, and then anybody who has had a recent surgery, bowel surgery, or is planning an upcoming surgery. And again, this is all to sort of preserve their nutrition status overall.
I think you make a really important point in that not just for the low FODMAP diet, but any diet is the importance of knowing particular foods that may be triggering to your symptoms. So there may be something that's on one of these diets that works well for a lot of other people who are on the diet and doing well, but it may be triggering to you. So it's important to have that idea of what's working for you, what's not. And we'll get to a few more, I guess maybe more specific questions, not just about diets, but getting down to a little bit more nitty gritty here and talking about L-glutamine. So this one from David: what about L-glutamine? Have been taking, and there seems to be an improvement. So going from the larger scale of like particular diets down to something very specific here. What are your thoughts on this, Jennifer?
Okay, so yes, that's it. These are great questions. So overall, well, what is L-glutamine? L-glutamine is an amino acid. We generally consider it to be non-essential. However, there's more research coming out now that's saying that in states of sort of catabolic stress, so meaning your body is breaking down energy stores to provide building blocks to yourself, as may happen in a Crohn's or colitis flare or following surgery, that this glutamine can become a conditionally essential amino acid, right? So it's essential in this state. It's sort of thought to play an important role in anti-inflammatory pathways, as well as our immune response to stress. However, even right now, the research in this area is still pretty much in its infancy. We're really just getting started. Most of the research that's been done to date is in animal models, so primarily rats and pigs. And then the subset of human research we have available generally refers to when patients are given parenteral solutions, so an intravenous type of protein or amino acids, where a group of patients will be given these intravenous proteins that contain glutamine, and then they're compared against a group that gets the intravenous amino acids without the glutamine. And there's sort of an observed clinical benefit. Now, again, can we say that this would correlate with oral L-glutamine? Right now, no. And as a dietitian, I always like to deal in numbers, right? That's where our data is. So right now, there's no evidence to say taking a set dose at a certain frequency for a certain duration provides a particular benefit. So it's really impossible for me to make any kind of specific recommendations around the use of L-glutamine orally as it stands currently. And again, I know that's a hard answer.
Well, a lot of these are hard answers here because we're still uncovering a lot of knowledge about the diets, and again, back to the diets and the idea of eliminating. Another one from David: currently trying a fructose elimination diet. Any thoughts on that, or is that something that's emerging now as another possibility for people who are looking to control their symptoms?
Yes and no. So there's definitely versions of fructose elimination diets out on the web right now. And there's a fair amount of overlap between a fructose elimination diet and a low FODMAP diet. Overall, again, if this was a one-on-one conversation I was having in my office, I would definitely want to explore what's the rationale for embarking on that type of elimination. What's the timeline? So if it comes down to wanting to manage specific diet triggers and symptoms, usually I will say, rather than broadly eliminating an entire group of foods, can we try to identify specific foods within that group that may actually be the individual triggers? And then again, establishing a timeline. As with pretty much all of the elimination diets, they're really not safe or sustainable over the long term. So again, more on exploring what's a safe duration to minimize risk of malnutrition. And then just from sort of a, again, from that individual's perspective, a fructose elimination diet does still contain a number of very common diet triggers for bowel symptoms. So again, it's not necessarily going to improve, everybody's symptoms on the whole.
Okay, and next question, one that I have a little bit of interest in myself, as I also am sans large intestine. This one came in from Vicky Thomas. Would like to know how the gut microbiome is impacted when the colon is removed. The word removed is not showing up on screen, but I believe that was in the question. So if someone has had surgery for their IBD and now is without a large intestine, either with an ostomy or a pelvic pouch, how is their gut microbiome impacted with that loss of a internal organ?
Such a good question, and one that I may have a difficult time answering. So it's true. When our patients that have their colon or their large bowels removed surgically and end up with either an endoleostomy or end up with a pelvic pouch or a J pouch, there's a sort of an adaptation that occurs. So we do know that. From a functional perspective, the small bowel can, over time, take on some of the functions of what your large bowel used to do. We know this more specifically applies to fluid absorption. Now, the data on how the small bowel adjusts from a microbiome perspective is extremely limited. I know myself, I spent some time on the web researching through some scholarly journals about this. And truthfully, the thought is with a pelvic pouch or a J pouch, we know that the bacteria sort of start to repopulate almost like they would in a large bowel, right? It sort of takes on some of that, those properties. But we don't know what happens, or there's not as much evidence to say what happens when somebody's living with an ileostomy. Now, certainly there are so many things that affect our gut microbiome: antibiotic use, gastrointestinal illness, amongst the dozens of other things. So as it stands right now, the literature is very, very limited on this subject, but it's still a really good question.
And unfortunately, that one of those questions that's really good, and there isn't a really great definitive answer for it. It's just the nature of where we are right now in understanding the disease. Back to a few more specifics. This one from Dana. I know nuts can be harmful to the gut. Again, for some people with Crohn's or colitis, the nuts are one of the trigger foods potentially. But how about nut butters or nut milks? How does that impact the gut? Are those safer than the regular original nuts?
This is a good question. So definitely to clarify what you had touched on, nuts themselves don't harm our bowel. They don't cause sort of physical injurious or sort of injure the bowel. However, for a lot of our patients living with Crohn's and colitis, whole nuts and whole seeds, meaning like a whole peanut or a whole almond, can trigger bowel symptoms. So generally it's diarrhea, but sometimes it can be cramping and other discomforts. Now, so again, we're always sort of differentiating between how diet is impacting the IBD and how diet is triggering symptoms, right? So we know that the whole nuts are not triggering underlying disease activity, but they are triggering symptoms. Okay. Now, when it comes to smooth nut butters, a lot of people might sort of say, well, it's kind of the same thing, isn't it? Like, you chew it up in your mouth, you sort of turn it into a nut butter, but truthfully, it's not. So smooth nut butters, meaning smooth peanut butter, smooth almond butter, typically have really good stool thickening benefits for our patients who are having a lot of diarrhea. So it's actually a great tool that patients can use, keep that in their toolbox to help manage the consistency of their stools when they're having a flare. Nut milks don't necessarily have any stool thickening qualities. However, so let's use almond milk as an example. Most almond milks nowadays are fortified with vitamin D and calcium. So they can be very, they're a nice substitute for people who don't tolerate dairy very well or at all. However, the big caveat with things like almond milk is that they're not a significant source of protein. So they're not necessarily sort of a one-to-one substitution with something like cow's milk or soy milk. However, if you have adequate sources of protein in other aspects of your diet, there's absolutely nothing wrong with including nut milk as part of your fluids. Actually, one thing to add about that is generally, I will recommend that patients choose unsweetened almond milk because occasionally the sweetened versions can trigger bowel symptoms.
Another good little nugget of advice, that along with smooth nut butters over crunchy.
Yes.
Back to the, again, certain specific kinds of diets. This one from Tammy, who's interested in the autoimmune protocol paleo diet. So again, another relatively new defined diet that could potentially have benefits for people with IBD. So thoughts on the autoimmune protocol paleo diet.
Okay. So yes, very, very interesting subset of diets. Unfortunately, I guess I'll back up for a second. Paleo diet is sort of predicated on this idea that our guts have not evolved to tolerate a modern, sort of westernized post-agriculture revolution diet. However, beyond that idea, there is very little research, possibly the least of all of the elimination diets, to say why could this be, triggering an inflammatory reaction? Why could this be contributing to an IBD type picture? The paleo diet in general is, again, very restrictive. So tends to put lots of emphasis on wild game meats, some vegetables, though things like legumes are restricted or avoided. And so again, with this type of elimination diet, we are predisposing our patients towards certain vitamin and mineral deficiencies. As with some of the other elimination diets, milk products are also to be avoided if you're following this. So again, as a dietitian, I have to come back to where's the evidence, right? If I'm going to increase somebody's risk of malnutrition, I want to make sure that I'm doing it in good conscience and to know that there's a sustainable benefit. And unfortunately, we don't have any evidence to say that an autoimmune paleo sort of type protocol diet would work for somebody living with Crohn's or colitis.
Okay, now just backing up to a couple of questions where you mentioned the nut milks and having some additional sweeteners in it. That kind of lends into another question that we received. This one from Steph. How should IBD patients approach consumption of artificial sweeteners and additives?
Good question. So in general, the research that we have on Some of the older artificial sweeteners typically says that, hey, these are safe to use. So the ones that I'm generally referring to would include, and now of course my mind's gone blank on what they're called.
Move on.
Yeah, like sort of like Splenda and things like that. We know that they are safe to use. There is still an upper limit for their use, though it's very difficult to reach that upper limit. Now, the one caveat with some artificial sweeteners from a symptom perspective is our sugar alcohols. So sugar alcohols are a type of artificial sweetener. If you can kind of picture, to sort of oversimplify, we essentially take a sugar and bind it to an alcohol group. And that makes it very difficult for the body to absorb that sugar. Now, as we've been talking about, having these excess sugars in the bowel tends to promote more flatulence and more diarrhea. So the easiest way to identify these types of sugar alcohols in your foods is looking for the ending OL. Frequently, these come as xylitol, sorbitol, mannitol, and they're often marketed as sugar-free foods, or they're often marketed as, say, diabetic candies, but they can also be included in things like breath mints and gum. So I do often recommend, because they are a fairly common trigger in the patients that I see, I do often recommend that people try to avoid them.
Okay, so a few more general questions that we've received from a number of people, either from the broadcast live tonight or from some of our previous social posts and previous webinars. So something that's come up a number of times: are there any supplements that people with IBD could benefit from? I know that there's always a concern about certain vitamin and mineral deficiencies if you have Crohn's or colitis, so can supplementation help to address some of that?
Definitely. This is a very common question for me. This is sort of ranks in the top 4 of questions I get asked. Quite frequently, and it's natural for our patient population to be concerned that they can become deficient in certain vitamins and minerals, especially given that when you're in a flare, your body's needs may increase. And at the same time, you're not feeling well, so you don't eat well. And it's harder for us to meet our needs at that time. There are some ways to kind of self-check, if you will. I'll often recommend in an appointment, we'll go through what somebody eats commonly and sort of compare that against Canada's food guide. And this is just for general adequacy of their diet. If we're noticing that there's large gaps, so there's whole food groups that are missing, meaning that there's lots of nutrients or vitamins or minerals missing there, or there may be specific eliminations in their current diet, then in that case, I'll often recommend that they do see their physicians, either your gastroenterologist or your family doctor, to have your blood work assessed. Keeping in mind also somebody's medical history can impact whether they are likely to experience these vitamin and mineral deficiencies. So, depending on where your Crohn's or colitis is most active, if you've had a surgical resection, if you're taking medications that are commonly known to affect our body's ability to utilize certain vitamins and minerals. Again, this will make me either more likely or less likely to recommend having your blood work reassessed. Now, the vitamins and minerals that I'm most likely to recommend getting checked in your blood work include your overall iron status. Okay, and this would include your hemoglobin, vitamin B12, since this is common amongst our Crohn's patients. Anybody who has disease activity in the end portion of their small bowel or has had that portion of their small bowel resected. And then vitamin D, since we know that our Crohn's and colitis patients are more likely to be deficient in vitamin D, as well as calcium. Okay. So a couple others that are less likely to be deficient, but again, depends on your individual medical history and the types of medications that you're on, include folic acid and then vitamins, fat soluble vitamins. So that's vitamins A, D, E, and K. Now, the reason why I recommend so strongly that you have your blood work reassessed, or assessed, I should say, is that supplements are not always indicated. And it is possible to cause harm by supplementing with vitamins and minerals that we do not need. So often people will say to me, oh, I just started taking, this one because my neighbor told me it was good. And then I read this one online, and next thing they know, they've got a handful of supplements they're taking every day, and they're not really sure why they're taking most of them. So again, too much of a good thing is not always a good thing. And the best way to know for sure whether you need to supplement with an individual vitamin or mineral is to make sure that you're getting your blood work checked. And again, you don't have to have it checked every month. Every 6 to 12 months is generally adequate for most of these. And of course, never hurts to see a dietitian just to make sure that if there's any gaps in your diet, we can work on substitutions.
I think you raise a good point too, as well, about maybe having too much when it comes to supplements, because I think a lot of people, myself included, have heard probably a number of times that if you take too much of a particular supplement, like your body will just pee it out, flush it out kind of on its own. And so like, what's the real harm in that? But, interesting to note that, yes, you can have too much of a good thing, even if it is a vitamin or a mineral supplement.
Absolutely.
So, more to a kind of lifestyle sort of question in terms of, eating out. So someone is going out with their friends to a restaurant, maybe a place that they've never been before, and they're a little bit concerned about what is on the menu may cause some symptoms as a result of eating out. So what are types of food that are good when eating out? That's a pretty broad question. Or maybe something a little bit more pointed, tips for eating out when it comes to managing your IBD.
This is a great question. I definitely, because we're trying to always heal that relationship with food, and we often socialize a lot around food, it's best for our patients to kind of have some strategies in mind before they go out. So first things first, in this sort of online world that we live in, it's easy to find menus for the most restaurants that you're going to. So I do really recommend, if it's on the restaurant's website or if you can find something in a Yelp review, go check out the menu and plan to identify 2, 3, even 4 choices that you think could be something that works for you. Now, when you get there, don't be afraid to advocate for changes. So I have done this myself in lots of different types of restaurants, because of course I can't recommend something unless I know I've tried it. And I found that most restaurants are quite accommodating. The only situation being where if like a sauce is pre-made and they can't remove a certain part. However, it never hurts to say, hey, I need cooked vegetables because I don't tolerate a raw, spinach salad very well. I need white rice over brown rice. And again, when, sort of expressed clearly and specifically, most restaurants are pretty happy to accommodate. And in general, you might start to find that certain types of restaurants are happy to accommodate, or it's easier to accommodate over others. I know that a lot of the patients I work with sort of have their, Chipotle, wrap shops that they'll hit, even Starbucks, you can find some good snacks on the go. And so they'll have their sort of top 6 list of restaurants they know they can hit and be able to find choices. And of course, we're lucky living in and around the Toronto area nowadays. There's a lot more restaurants that are able to accommodate food allergies and dietary restrictions. So again, never hurts to ask.
And I think a friend of mine has a list of all of her either food allergies or sensitivities. She'll just bring that on paper, hand it to the server and say, here's everything that I can't eat. Just what can you recommend that is on the menu that doesn't have these things? And so, yeah, advocating for yourself, I think, is an important part when you are eating out. So if the menu says no substitutions, please just go ahead and push for the substitutions anyway, because it's, at the end of the day, it's your health, right? So we want to advocate in every situation where you can.
Absolutely.
And so getting back to going away from restaurants back to home meal preparation, any cookbook recommendations for people with IBD?
Yes. So there's an emerging market for cookbooks for people living with IBD. And I may be showing some of my loyalty to Mount Sinai, but there's a Crohn's and Colitis diet guide by my colleague Julie Chepo and Dr. Hilary Steinhardt that work at Mount Sinai with me. And it's incredibly comprehensive. There's a ton of recipes. Each of them is sort of individually tagged or earmarked in terms of whether they're low fiber or vegetarian. And so it makes it very easy for patients to identify, hey, I can cook these certain recipes. And I know that's probably going to work for me. And, maybe I'll try this one with a small substitution. In terms of what's available on the broader web, I individually as a dietitian working in this area, I've had a harder time finding reliable free recipes. But again, doesn't hurt to turn to, the larger organizations that tend to work in these areas. So obviously Crohn's and Colitis Canada, Crohn's and Colitis Foundation in the States, they tend to link more towards evidence-based nutrition and cooking resources. If you're looking for things on low FODMAP, Monash University has a huge recipe database on their website. So it sort of depends on your individual needs, but try to stick where the evidence is when possible and where the main organizations for your health concerns are.
All right, and next question, again, probably something that you have addressed a number of times. People want to have a little bit of fun maybe and enjoy a adult beverage now and then. So how does alcohol intake affect IBD, either positively or negatively?
Yes, definitely with patio season upon us, I am getting this question more and more these days. And it tends that our Crohn's and colitis patients are younger and, like to be social. So in general, when it comes to alcohol can trigger symptoms for our Crohn's and colitis patients. Now, in terms of what types of alcohols trigger symptoms, again, very individual. I tend to hear that because beer is carbonated, it is more likely to trigger symptoms for some patients. But then for our patients living with ileostomies, I tend to hear that wines and specifically sweeter white wines tend to be more triggering for liquid stoma outputs for those patients. So again, it helps to know sort of what you're having, what is it mixed with, and how it impacts you. Also, a lot of our patients living with IBD tend to report that they are a lightweight. They tend to be a cheap date compared to maybe pre-diagnosis. So that's something to keep in mind, is making sure that you're drinking safely, you're drinking within moderation. Make sure that you're eating when you do drink something. And then, of course, make sure that there are no contraindications to having alcohol with the types of medications that you're taking to manage your IBD.
I'm not a cheap date, just overly affectionate. Next question. We'll move on quickly. So this has come up a couple of times in the chat tonight, and as well with other people who have IBD and may unintentionally lose a lot of weight. So if someone is trying to prevent weight loss, or they've had a significant amount of weight loss as a result of an IBD flare, or potentially a hospitalization or surgery, so what are some safe ways to put that weight back on?
Great question. This is probably one of the most common types of appointments I have in my practice, unfortunately, because of the types of patients that I see. Now, in general, when it comes to either preventing unintentional weight loss or regaining weight that may have been lost during a flare following surgery, I kind of get people to look at it from the perspective that eating becomes a little bit of a hobby in addition to something that we may do for fun or just for good nutrition. And so what I mean by that is that you may find yourself needing to eat a little bit more frequently. And sometimes this is indicated because you may not be able to tolerate the volume of food that you used to be able to tolerate. So smaller, more frequent meals can certainly help. Next, it's a lot about trying to add small amounts of very calorie-dense foods. So again, we're not trying to say, sit down and eat this huge buffet worth of food. Instead, focus on eating small amounts of very calorie-dense foods. And what I mean by calorie-dense foods are things like our plant oils, so olive oil. Obviously, things like butter or margarine tend to be more calorie-dense. The smooth nut butters we mentioned earlier. Of course, dairy products tend to be a great place if you do tolerate milk products well. Having a nice high-fat Greek yogurt can be really tasty. It'll be one of the few times you'll hear a dietitian tell you to eat cheesecake and ice cream regularly. And of course, when I'm referring to high-fat dairy, I'm usually meaning things that have at least 3% milk fat or more. So that means whole milk. And there's some beautiful Greek yogurts out on the market right now that have 9% milk fat and more, which again are great for helping facilitate that weight gain in small volumes. And then, of course, things like making sure you're getting enough protein. So in general, it doesn't mean you need to sit down and eat a chicken breast at every meal, but including even a little bit of cooked chicken if you tolerate that well. Adding some scrambled eggs to your white rice. And so again, it's sort of about adding these small amounts of calorie or protein dense foods to each and every meal and snack. So a great way to start training your brain is to ask a simple question. Anytime you're about to eat, you would ask yourself, what can I add to this? And again, it's not about adding a steak on the side of your lobster, right? It's not about big volumes. It's about small volumes. So as I mentioned earlier, we know that white rice tends to be a good stool thickener. What I might suggest is, can we cook that up with a little bit of olive oil and then add a scrambled egg, or like egg fried rice? If you're having a slice of toast and you're thinking, well, maybe I'll have some smooth peanut butter on that toast, what can you add? I would probably get somebody to try to layer their spreads. What I mean by that is you would put a little bit of butter or margarine underneath that peanut butter. Okay, or if you're going to have a grilled cheese sandwich, can I add some sliced turkey to that? Again, so just layering on those protein and calorie dense foods. Now, of course, it doesn't hurt if you do tolerate them well. Things like milkshakes and smoothies, typically in between meals, tends to be a good time, since we know that fluids tend to fill our stomachs and make us feel full quite quickly. I don't usually recommend taking those foods at a meal, but perhaps considering taking them in between meals as part of a snack.
Got it. And now you mentioned a number of meat products within that idea, like potentially gaining weight. And so another question that's come up, and another topic that's come up just from the discussion that we're seeing on Facebook, is about plant-based diets, or just eating more plants and maybe avoiding animal products. So can you talk about the link between animal products, and I guess not just meats, but dairy products as well, and Crohn's, and I guess by extension colitis as well?
Okay. Yes, good question. So animal products and Crohn's colitis, looking from a sort of global epidemiological prevention point of view, there is a bit of research to say that a diet that is higher in animal products is associated with development of Crohn's or colitis. But again, that research is very broad. It's very difficult to link causation. We really can't say that with any certainty diets that are higher in animal products, cause Crohn's or colitis. From a symptom management perspective, in general, the animal products so chicken, fish, tend to be very well tolerated in the patients I work with Crohn's and colitis. They're good, easy sources of energy and protein that are high in biological value, tend to be digested and absorbed fairly easily. They can also be consumed even if somebody's following a low fiber diet, which is very helpful for a lot of patients if they have a history of strictures or have undergone a recent surgery. Now, in terms of links between animal products and flares, I know there's sort of, again, a tiny bit of research in colitis that says diets that are higher in red meat may be associated with a higher frequency of colitis flares. Again, though, we definitely can't say that there's a causative link there. And in terms of our patients living with Crohn's that I'm aware of, there's no link between disease activity and consumption of animal products.
Got it. Now I see that we are getting close to the 1 hour mark. So just wrapping up with the last question here for people who are interested in finding more information about diet or maybe working with a dietitian close to them, how can someone find a dietitian in their area?
Yes, great question. So I'm very fortunate to work where I work and get to work with the patients that I get to see. So if you happen to be a patient of a Mount Sinai gastroenterologist or general surgeon, then you can certainly get a referral to come in and see me. However, for everybody else,
which is a lot of people watching,
which is a lot of people, pretty much everybody, the easiest or quickest ways to find dietitians in your area: one, go to dietitians.ca. That's the Dietitians of Canada website. There is a Find a Dietitian link there. So dietitians.ca, find a dietitian. You can search dietitians not only by your location, but also by their areas of specialization. So it's easier to find somebody who has experience with GI disorders. Also, check in with your gastroenterologist and see if they are aware of any outpatient dietitian services in your area that they may already be linked with. Same with your family physicians. And if you happen to be part of a family health team or linked with a physician who works with a family health team, you can access a dietitian that way. Finally, there are dietitians in most, if not all, of the Loblaws and Zehrs stores in Ontario, and then again across other parts of the country. So double check in with your local store to see if they have a dietitian. Sobeys, I believe, now also has some in-store dietitians in certain stores. And unlockfood.ca, which was formerly Eat Right Ontario, but is now unlockfood.ca, also has links to help find dietitians in your local area, as well as recipes and resources that are geared towards people living with IBD.
And there it is, unlockfood.ca, just for good measure to wrap things up tonight. So again, for everyone who commented tuned in, asked questions, or responded to questions within the comments thread. Thank you so much for being part of our talk here tonight. Once again, Jennifer Ball, a registered dietitian working in outpatient GI medicine and surgery and home TPN at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. Thank you so much for your time, Jennifer. Really appreciate all the expertise and all the answers, even when there are some answers that we don't quite know the answers to yet. We're going to keep obviously pushing research forward and doing our best. And thanks for everyone, again, tuning in tonight and being part of the conversation. We'll talk to you again soon. Have yourselves a good night.
Thanks.